I seem to be causing a bit of confusion on the internet. Almost on a daily basis, I get asked how I manage to grow my large plants in such small pots. Now, what if I told you that you don't need a pot at all? Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you about growing plants without using a pot. 5 months ago, I started the experiment with this Monstera dubia. So let's have a look at what happened back in December. It's time for another experiment. One comment I get a lot is people questioning how my plants are so happy and healthy, despite the fact that they're in quite small pots. Most of my plants are in 14 or 20 centimeter pots only. And compared to the size of the plant, the pot looks ridiculously small. The secret to growing large plants is light and, of course, building a large enough root system that can sustain a plant of that size. So with a pot that small, how come that my plants are so large? Well, the secret lies within the moss pole. Most of the root system is inside the moss pole in itself, not the pot, which means that technically I should be able to grow a plant without any pot at all. Okay, so we have Monstera dubia over here, still in juvenile form. You can see it's in a quite small pot. It's 14 centimeters and the top of its moss pole finished over here. A couple of weeks ago, it reached the top of its moss pole. So I just took a grow vertical pole and just stacked it inside. So these two poles aren't actually connected. I literally just pushed it in here. And it somehow stayed connected. I don't know. The plant then started growing on that grow vertical pole, and I want to cut that plant now and just continue growing it on that grow vertical pole without actually potting it up. So I will just snip that. Take that out. All right. That bottom half is going to reshoot, maybe even in a couple of spots. So that definitely is not going to waste. But this is the plant that I want to continue growing. I have a mature Monstera dubia as well, but I really love the juvenile form, specifically because I like the shingling and the silver. But hey Brad, do you like my Monstera dubia? You can sniff, but you can't eat. Excuse me. You are blocking the view. Now, to keep it juvenile, I gave it less light than I gave my mature one, because obviously the more light exposure my plant gets, the faster it will mature. So I actually purposely wanted to keep this juvenile by giving it pretty much the darkest spot in my apartment. I mean, you saw it at the beginning of the video. It was just located right behind me. Now, because it's been so dark in that spot, I feel like it hasn't really produced a lot of silver on its leaves, which is unfortunate. So specifically now that I'm already pushing it by not giving it a pot to expand a root system into, I'm going to give this a little bit more light so that hopefully it keeps growing and hopefully keeps giving me more silverish leaves, but I don't think it's going to mature anytime soon, just purely because, well, I am giving it limited room for roots. Now, there is room in the pole in itself for the root system, so it should technically totally be fine just growing on there. But of course, it will have a bit of a setback now because it doesn't have that much of a root system. It previously had that whole bottom part of the pole, including all of the leaves to support the new growth on top. Now it really only has these 3-4 leaves to help it re-establish and send out new growth. So I'm expecting this to revert back to smaller now, but I mean, that's kind of exactly what I'm trying to achieve with this anyway. So I just put a bit of wire at the top so I can just hang it on my wall, and I suppose I'll check in with you in a couple of months' time to see if this experiment was successful. 5 months later, this plant looks like this. I suppose the plant isn't thriving to its best ability, but I actually blame this on the conditions. This plant is actually growing outside at the moment. We are going into winter, and it can go down to 7 or 8 degrees at nighttime. So the plant isn't having the best time adjusting to the cooler conditions. But despite that, it has grown 3 leaves for me since I gave it a chop. Well, the first leaf was this. So it was obviously tiny, and it was, a poor excuse of a leaf, but that was to be expected. When I gave it a chop, that plant now suddenly is missing all of that support system that it had down below. So it's gonna focus on growing a root system first before it's gonna give me new leaves. So it's always normal to have the first leaf being, well, a bit challenged due to, well, the challenge I gave the plant. But straight after that, it gave me this leaf with a decent size. And then it even started growing fenestrations. So you can't tell me that this plant isn't happy. If it's thriving to its best ability, but if I would want to make it thrive even more, I don't think I necessarily need to give it a pot straight away. I would just have to give it better conditions. But the whole point of this experiment was really to show you that the size of the pot doesn't really matter. The pole is a vertical extension of your pot, and as such, it can also be the pot in itself. The pole is filled with moss in this instance, and moss is a growing medium, so the plant has an easy time rooting into the moss and then establishing a new root system within the moss pole in itself. I'll bring it closer. Almost every single node has thrown a big chunky root into the pole, and now they're all coming out down here. Now, if we're looking at the back, and it's hard to see because it's not the see-through pole, but can you see these darker discolorations over here? Those are all roots. So this moss pole is full of roots. So in this instance, the moss pole isn't just an extension of the pot, the moss pole is the pot. And compared to a traditional pot where, well, really just the bottom nodes can root into the potting medium and then, that root system is responsible for all of the plant, every single node has its own root system over here because every single node makes contact with the growing medium. Now, talking about the growing medium, yes, I chose moss because I've had the best experiences with moss, and it's actually the cleanest, especially if you don't have a pot to catch anything falling out. The moss kind of just sticks in there by itself. But you could fill this with any other potting medium. So I've seen people use cocoa chips or bark, or most recently I also started using tree fern fiber, but that would all just fall through if you don't have a pot. Now, I've also seen people be creative and kind of just, yeah, come on, you can play with it. No, you don't want to play with it. Now, I've also seen people be creative and kind of clip this shut at the bottom so that the water doesn't just drip out. I grow mine outside, as I said before, so I don't mind water dribbling out of here. Talking about watering, now that the plant doesn't have a pot down below, it is even more essential that I am not letting the pole dry out completely. Whenever I talk about the moss pole, I basically just tell you to treat it in the exact same way as you would treat a pot. If you have a plant where you don't want the medium to dry out completely before the next watering, apply the same principle onto your moss pole as well. We're just doing it vertically instead of having this horizontal spread of a pot. But the principles are the exact same. Now, am I surprised by these results? Not at all. When I started the experiment, I knew it was going to be a success. I just really wanted to do it because proof is in the pudding. But I'm using this concept of the moss pole being a vertical pot all the time. You probably heard about my chop and extend, and if you haven't, I'll pop in a video on the right over here. Basically what I do when my poles reach the top of the moss pole, I chop the top part of the moss pole, the part with the beautiful growth, and I pot it back up, and then I re-extend it. Now at that stage, there's nothing in the pot. I'm not potting up roots, I'm just potting up a moss pole, but all of the roots are within the moss pole. So if it wasn't for the moss pole being an extension of the pot, my chop and extend process wouldn't work. For the chop and extend to work, it's fundamental that every single node has grown roots into the moss pole or whatever kind of support you have chosen. Now, there was even one time where I did a bit of a rescue mission because my Epipremnum pinnadum basically just had root rot. The entire pot was just rot, including the stem leading up to the moss pole. But the plant in itself was still growing and still giving me larger leaves. And that was just because the plant was rooted into the moss pole. If the plant would have purely relied on the root system within the pot, that plant would be dead, but it doesn't. The moss pole is basically like a security. Even if something goes wrong down here, every single node has its own root system. So, you know, you're basically like ensuring that even if things go south, your plant will always be able to survive. And lastly, this concept is also what enables me to propagate plants really well. Now that I know that every single node has rooted in here, I could just chop in between every single node and end up having 5 or 6 plants on the same moss pole over here. Now, of course, this doesn't work for like a plant like an oxalis or an alocasia, plants that aren't climbing. But these plants, or like this dubia, for example, would be a semi-epiphyte. So in nature, they would grow up trees. So any of my climbing aeroids, this is possible. Now, is this something that I recommend? It depends. Now, these roots down here, they're desperate to expand. If I would pop a pot on here, that root system would expand. And of course, the more roots, the better your plant can grow ultimately. So this is kind of a bit of a waste, because as soon as the roots kind of reach here, they don't really grow anymore because there's nothing really for them to grow into. So am I going to do this with all of my plants? Definitely not. Is this an option for a plant here and there? For example, where you want to hang something, but you don't want to have a pot hanging there? Totally. I just recently done it with my El Choco and it's thriving. One second. Alrighty, have a look at this. So maybe just a month ago, I took this plant and I potted it on this bigger moss pole, and I decided to not give it a pot because it hangs in my IKEA cabinet and there's not that much room in the IKEA cabinet, so I thought, why waste room on the pot down here that it doesn't really need? And since I repotted it, it has given me this leaf over here. So, yeah, it looks very happy to me. Now, of course, this plant is living in perfect condition inside my IKEA cabinet. Really, really high humidity, great light, probably a little bit too much light for it, to be honest. A lot of consistency compared to this plant that just had to go through all the ups and downs outside. So I'm not surprised that this plant is thriving more than this is. First and foremost, what is really setting the potential for your plant to grow are the conditions that you grow them in. You're intrigued by this, aren't you? Alrighty, I'm gonna wrap it up over here because Brettles wants some attention. Now, in this video, I spoke about not having a pot at all, and I hope it made the impact that these moss poles can have really, really clear. But in my next video, I want to talk about pot sizes overall because, well, we're not going to get away without using pots ever. So I hope you found this informative. Subscribe so you're not missing out on the next video, and I would love for you to share this with anybody who could benefit from this information. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Happy growing! Bye! Okay, bye.